Hello, everyone. A warm good afternoon to one and all. Welcome to the second day of Sri Ram Research Festival 2021, a celebration of ideas hosted by the Economic Society Sri Ram College of Commerce. With an aim to promote intellectual discourse between the eager minds and accomplished personalities, this festival aspires to acknowledge and amplify the drive for unique and authentic research. I am Abhiram Loganathan, and I take much privilege in welcoming you all to this first session of our second day. Today, we are indeed very delighted to have with us a respected academician from the field of developmental economics and economic history. With much delectation, let me introduce Dr. Praveen Jha, the founding chairperson of Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies and the professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning in the School of Social Sciences in Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Sir also serves as a visiting professor at the University of Kassel in Germany and at the African Institute of Agrarian Studies in Harare. With a career spanning over 30 years, Sir has been a distinguished faculty and a fellow at various prestigious institutions, including the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy of Administration in Missouri, University of Bremen in Germany, and the International Labour Organization. Apart from being a widely published academic in the field of labor economics, poverty, public finance, and history of economic thought, Sir has also served as a member in various government policy committees and as a consultant to various international organizations. Sir is also the founding member of the Agrarian South Network and the founding editor of Agrarian South, the Journal of Political Economy. We are immensely delighted to have Sir with us today for a session on the major markers of contemporary imperialism. Before we begin, may I kindly remind the audience that Sir's sessions will be followed by a moderated Q&A. You may therefore feel free to ask your questions by typing them into the Q&A box. Without much delay, with immense honor and delight, may I invite Dr. Praveen Jha for his opening remarks and for sharing his insights with the audience. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much for your kind words and warm welcome. I'm indeed delighted to be with you. It's always a pleasure to interact with our future, those who are young and looking forward. We possibly are sort of getting into a mode where our received ways of thinking are getting challenged by all of you, and hopefully they will get more and more challenged as we evolve. That is how the progress happens. Now, this theme which I have suggested is one which has a vast canvas, a very, very large canvas. And to speak of some of the important issues, I need to give you a backdrop of contextualizing some of these major markers of contemporary imperialism. So before I come to those substantive points, let me make a few remarks which will help you get a sense of the backdrop, get the sense of the challenges there, get the sense of contestations and so on. Okay. Now, importance of imperialism as an analytical construct, as a very powerful idea, is common to the political economy tradition, in particular, the Marxian political economy. I'm sure some of you have been engaging with these arguments. When it comes to the alternative discourse or discourses with which you are more familiar, which is mainstream economics and its variants and different versions and so on, it has no relevance to that. Within that framework, to the extent that you talk of some unequal power relations, etc., it is not framed as anything systemic in the sense of imperialism, etc. In fact, the great Nobel laureate, late Sir John Hicks, as he put it once, that to the extent that there are these hierarchies and so on, and trying to exercise some control by one country over the other, and so on. All this is simply a remnant of feudalism. It's a remnant from the earlier times. Hicks had a very short, interesting book on theory of economic history, right? Which is where he discusses these things. Right? So in general, so this is a very important point for all of us to keep in mind, that mainstream economics does not even recognize the issues related to imperialism and the implications of the same and so on. So it's fundamentally within the Marxian political economy discourse that you get a very substantive engagement with this idea. However, even within the Marxist political economy, the range of approaches you have will confound you. There are all kinds of definitions, all kinds of understanding of the underlying processes, outcomes, etc. Now, to highlight that very simple point, but fundamentally a very complex point, let me just give you an illustration from two extremes. Yeah. On the one hand, Marx, for whom imperialism was central to capitalism as a whole, from its genesis or even before its genesis, right, to the current juncture. It, in a sense, is the lifeblood, okay, of capitalism, where he highlights the processes of primitive accumulation as being a permanent feature, okay, of capitalism, which includes conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, genocide, name it, everything. Now, that's one extreme. The other extreme, you have someone like, let's say, Bill Warren, very well-known Marxist political economist, who builds on some of the stray remarks by Marx and has a book which became very famous, early 1970s, Imperialism, the Pioneer of Capitalism. That is, imperialism may have several terrible consequences and so on, but for the global South, for the developing world at large, it infused the processes of capitalist development which might not have happened in the absence of imperialism. Now, that is a kind of conclusion which might seem utterly absurd to many of us, but you have a whole range, and I just mentioned, in a sense, two metaphors at the extremes of the spectrum of views. Right? Within that, you have too many sophisticated views, etc. So this is something which we need to keep in mind. So whether it's processes, outcomes, how do we think of it, imperialism as a category, and so on. Right? Now, in that context, I would suggest that let's start with a very simple definition, possibly the simplest definition, okay, of imperialism, which I have used in many of my writings, which is imperialism is extra-national, extra-territorial reach by global capital, okay, extensions by global capital in quest of ever greater surplus, surplus value, right? Now, this could be a very useful starting point to think of imperialism, right? And then looking at the particular context, particular phases, particular junctures, we can fill in important attributes which would be relevant from that point of view. Right? So this point of view, okay, the definition which I am suggesting, in my assessment, flows directly from Marx. Okay, of course, much of theorizing on imperialism happened among the first generation of Marxists. Lenin, Luxemburg, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Kautsky, they were the major kind of figures in the first generation who engaged with the idea of imperialism, with a lot of differences amongst them and so on. But what I'm suggesting to you is one which I would contend flows directly from Dr. Karl Marx in terms of understanding of imperialism, locating imperialism, and so on. Okay. In short, this perspective accords centrality to imperialism in the functioning of capitalism. Okay, it is the lifeblood on a global scale since its inception to the current juncture, right? So the permanent presence of processes which mark exploitation of one part of the world by the other part of the world, okay? Accumulation dynamics where you have uneven but combined development, again to use one of Marx's phrase, right? All these are absolutely central to such an architecture of imperialism, right? However, Lenin himself, for instance, said something which became possibly one of the most famous ways of starting a discourse on imperialism. What does he say? Imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, right? So in a sense, it is implying as if imperialism is not something which is central to global capitalism from its inception to where we have come today. But it should be viewed more as a particular stage, highest stage of capitalism. Right? For Lenin, that starts somewhere towards the end of 19th century, 1880s, 1890s. He starts engaging very eloquently with the conversations and analysis of imperialism. Right? And Lenin, as all of you would recall, departs in 1923 or so. Lenin, in fact, analyzed imperialism of his time in extremely eloquent and extremely insightful fashion. In fact, he predicted the First World War as a contestation between monopolies located in different powerful metropolitan countries, the conflict between them and how that would lead to. So just before the World War, World War I, he had predicted that it's around the corner, right? And all that had flown from his analysis of imperialism. Okay, if you look at some other scholars who again think in terms of stages or phases and so on, some of you may have heard of Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah was the statesman, the great revolutionary from Ghana, right? And he in fact coined a different phrase. Right? He said, looking at the more current period, basically the post-Second World War phase, for that he preferred the term neo-colonialism, right? And he suggested that neo-colonialism is the last stage, the final stage of imperialism, right? So now imperialism itself is getting divided into phases, right? Some of my work with my close friend Paris Yoras, a Brazilian Marxist, yeah, we talk in terms of early neocolonialism and late neocolonialism, and how late neocolonialism is indeed different, but we think of all these phases very much as part of imperialism itself. Right? Then you have scholars who argue that the contemporary juncture, in particular the period since 1970s or so, which is often described as neoliberal capitalism. Right? So there are several scholars who describe this phase as neo-imperialism. Right? So imperialism itself has distinct stages, and you have a neo-imperialism, etc. Right? In short, what I'm trying to sort of alert you to is that even within the Marxist discourse, you have a canvas which is hugely contested, in terms of how do we define it? Right? Do we think of it as, to put it very simply, as something central to the evolution of global capitalism and being forever present in every stages, etc., right? Or do we think of it at a particular stage? If we opt for the former, of course, we will have to identify what are the distinct traits and characteristics in each one of these stages of imperialism. And so, if you look at some of our greatest Marxist scholars, in particular the two Patnayaks from India, Utsa Patnaik and Pravat Patnaik, their recent book published this year, okay, which is talking about imperialism, its history, its theory, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, for them, imperialism is something which is a feature of capitalism all through, but each phase can have very distinct traits and attributes and so on. All right. So that is how we have this field which we need to engage with. And let me not get into a fuller discussion of these contestations. And I would rather come to a point of view which, as I have already indicated, is my preferred point of view, flowing from, let's say, the work of Patnaiks and starting from Karl Marx himself and so on. Right? But before I come to the current stage and some of its markers, let me also tell you that you have a number of Marxists who have come to take the view that maybe imperialism is not a very relevant category anymore. Right? A whole lot of, in particular, after the Second World War, and in particular during this neoliberal global capitalism, its relevance has become much weaker, so we should just drop it. But let me, as I said, let me not get into all these alternative views, etc. But I wanted you to be aware of it so that you should not feel as if I have given you only one line, right? The line that I prefer, yeah? Okay. Now that you know my preferred sort of interpretation of how we should go about it, and a very significant body of scholarship is of that view. I have mentioned some names there. What is it that it would focus on when it comes to the current juncture? What are the issues which it would flag as the major markers and so on? Let me come to that, right? Now, if you look at evolution of global capitalism, in an intertemporal sense, we can easily divide it into, let's say, three distinct phases. First phase was one of direct political control. Now, that direct political control, many scholars, in fact, most scholars of Marxist orientation, like to describe as colonialism. So one distinction between colonialism and imperialism is in terms of the first has direct political control, the second does not have the direct political control, right? After that, you have a phase of regulated capitalism, almost in a global sense, and part of the world, almost 1/3 of the world, at the same point, roughly around the same time, from 1920s, 30s, moving into the post-World War II period, and coming up to, in some cases, up to 1970s, and finally 1991, which is a kind of a closure of that part of the experiment, which was the most fascinating experiment in many ways, which is the socialism, right? So as you know, one part of the world, was described as being outside the capitalist system, right? But you could think in terms of a regulated state capitalism also, right? Or a regulated kind of order, yeah? So that's the second phase. Again, I'll not go into the details of all this, but from 1970s onwards, we can certainly say that the world in an intertemporal sense, comes to the third phase, which is neoliberal capitalism, right? Which is the sharpening of the teeth and claws of imperialism in many, many different directions and different ways and so on. Okay. So sometimes this regulated phase is one which I like to describe as, a period from the Bandung moment to the Berlin moment. Berlin moment is when the Berlin Wall collapsed, and Soviet Union disappeared. Right? Bandung moment is one where there was tremendous kind of solidarity amongst countries in the global south, developing world, etc. And at the same time, you also had regulated capitalism elsewhere. Lyndon Johnson once very famously said, we are all Keynesians now. Right? The construction of the welfare state in particular, northwestern part of Europe, right? A fantastic kind of experiment and so on. Now, all that was part of the regulated capitalism. Right? So what has happened in this intertemporal sense, even though we had a phase of regulated capitalism, if you look at some of the most important markers of global economic indicators, what has happened? Essentially, a rise of inequality all through, right? It was somewhat contained during that regulated capitalist period, but it's not the case that the trend had become something very different, right? In a global sense. So for instance, if you look at the top 20% of the countries, bottom 20% of the countries, look at different kinds of measures and so on. What is happening to the per capita income between them and so on. So if you look at the, let's say, there are different ways of measuring it. And I'm sure some of you have been engaging with these, right? So top 5, bottom 5, top 20, bottom 20, and so on and so forth. Whatever measure you take, okay? We find that there has been a massive increase in inequality in terms of per capita incomes and standard indicators, etc. Right? If you look at some other indicator and look at the last 50 years or so, right? And go to, let's say, the Fortune's list of top kind of economic entities or transnational institutes measurement, yeah, of who are the top economic actors in terms of revenues. Right? At the current juncture, if you list these 100 top economic actors globally, you would be, if you have not done this exercise, you would be shocked and surprised to know 71 of these are corporations, 29 are countries. 71 are corporations. The world has approximately 200 countries or so. Yeah. So as soon as you go beyond G7, G8, and so on, immediately you have these heavy-duty, very muscled multinational corporations, yeah, who start figuring in that list in terms of their revenues and so on. Right? If you look at the turnover of, let's say, Walmart, yeah, and look at some 48 least developed countries, you will have to combine many of them to come anywhere close to Walmart, right? So if you look at these indicators, okay, of what is happening in the global economy, right, you find that very important actor at the current stage in terms of shaping the economic outcomes across the world, okay, is indeed this clutch of very, very powerful economic actors, yeah, something that we call transnational corporations, multinational corporations, and so on, right? Often you hear a lot of talk about China suddenly becoming important and so on and so forth. The most recent data that you get from UNCTAD, this tells you that of the 100 largest multinational companies in the world, more than 80 are headquartered in North America and Europe, 80 to be precise, North America and Europe, Western Europe. Of course, Eastern Europe is a different kettle of fish. 11 in Japan, 4 in China, 1 each in South Korea, Malaysia, and Mexico. As it happens, we had one, but Mr. Mittal shifted his base to Belgium. He headquartered it there, ArcelorMittal, right? So this small kind of happiness which we had of having at least 1 in the 100, even that disappeared, right? Now, what is happening? It is indeed the case that some of the countries in the global south, developing world, etc., have emerged in significant ways. China, of course, is the leader of the pack. India also during the last 40 years. In fact, if you look at last 40 years on an average, China and India for this entire period on an average, okay, in terms of rate of GDP growth, okay, are number 1 and number 2. Of course, China is almost 40% ahead of us, but indeed, nonetheless, what is happening in terms of, sort of this shaping of the overall economic architecture of the world in terms of economic power, right? So a lot of production is indeed happening in China, but is China in a position to retain that surplus, or a lot of surplus is flowing out of China? So very famous Chinese political economist Minky Lee, he tells you that in fact, China gets much less from the rest of the world than what flows out of China, even though China currently is indeed what you would describe as the manufacturing hub of the world, the factory of the world, right? In terms of its share in global manufacturing, it's already 28%. But is it able to retain the value, retain the surplus? If not, why not? What are the mechanisms at work and so on? It is these questions and issues that we have to grapple with as current markers and so on. So let me quickly flag some of the most important features which I think are absolutely central in understanding the current architecture of imperialism, the current phase of imperialism, what we sometimes also describe as late neocolonialism, right? Me and my colleagues, I have already mentioned, yeah. So let me quickly give you some features in this sense. Contemporary capitalism, as late Samir Amin used to say, is indeed a capitalism of generalized monopolies. The power of monopolies in every segment, whether it's production, whether it's finance, what have you, media, technology, and so on and so forth. So Samir Amin coined this phrase, contemporary imperialism is a capitalism of generalized monopolies. Now, that is the first feature we need to keep in mind, right? Second, there is a massive increase in the power of something called finance capital, and I'll explain that in a moment, what exactly I mean by that. And there too, you have a massive presence of the monopoly power in finance capital itself, right? Third, as it happens, monopoly of the US dollar and the intellectual property regime, any other currency, okay, does not have the same kind of heft that the US dollar has. So we have to ask, what is it that keeps the US at the center in terms of this architecture of the global monetary system and so on? The gold standard disappeared ages ago, 50 years ago, right? But why is it that, it continues to be that powerful, right? So if we go to the next thing, in terms of understanding the current architecture, there is indeed a lot of competition between monopolies across the world, but since most of these are headquartered in the global north, there is also very powerful what we can describe as international oligarchic alliances. Otherwise, we would not have seen the kind of sort of relative stability in their treatment of each other and so on. Remember that just before the World War, they were at each other's throat. They were out to get each other and so on. Now, it's a very different juncture that we are talking about. Yeah. And finally, the fifth feature that I would like to highlight as my preliminary remark in terms of giving you a sense of the current architecture is that globalized contradictions of capitalism and various crises of the system, yeah, have created a whole range of predatory, hegemonic, fraudulent, decaying, and parasitic practices, largely in the global south. Right? Of course, some of it is in evidence in the north as well, but there you have a kind of oligarchic alliance that I already mentioned. Yeah. So these would be, let's say, some of the important features to focus on. I will talk about a couple of very important economic dimensions and processes in a minute. But before that, let me also give you a sense of, through some numbers, etc., yeah, to get a better feel of some of these things, yeah, some of these features and so on. You know, Lenin himself had talked of some 5 traits which he identified with imperialism, and how we have come to a stage where some of the features which he had identified, but which indeed were in the nascent stage, for instance, export of capital. It was not a dominant trait or attribute, but Lenin thought that that indeed was one of the, in fact, the most important feature that he had highlighted in that listing of the 5 traits and so on. But that has become much more important today, right? So let me just give you a couple of numbers which will, you know, kind of give you some sense of the 5 traits that I identified very quickly. So the number of multinational corporations has indeed grown globally. Multinational corporations are the driving force. They have a massive stranglehold and so on. So if you look at between 1980 and 2010 or so, roughly the increase of such corporations, multinational corporations, is from 15,000 to 82,000. The number of overseas subsidiaries of these corporations grew even faster, right? Likewise, if you look at how many of them sort of are truly in the driver's seat, yeah, in terms of controlling, let's say, the global GDP and so on. Okay, so if you look at, let me give you some figures based on a study done by Gladfeld, Stefano Battiston, and so on. I'm using their data. Okay, so they find that, and this is based on a very large survey, more than 43,000 multinational corporations, that the top 737 multinational corporations controlled 80% of total global GDP, right? They give you a number which is even starker in the same study. Of this, what they call a core, 147 multinational corporations controlled nearly 40% of the economic value, okay, of the total global GDP at that point in time, right? If you look at a number of similar other indicators, what time is it? It's almost, I've already taken some more than 30 minutes. Abhinam, how much time do you want me to take? Another 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
Yes, sir, as long as you please.
Okay.
Right.
No, but because we should have some time for, you know, discussion also, no? But
Yes.
I'll just give you 1 or 2, you know, sort of other numbers of this kind before coming to some processes that I want to flag as major markers. Okay. If you look at, let's say, the global market for seeds, only yesterday the farm laws were repealed, thankfully, yeah, or rather the process has begun. Let's see how far does it go. So of the total international seed market, barely 3 companies control more than 70% currently, right? Now, there are different estimates. I'm giving you the bottom, 70%. Some estimates put it almost up to 90% or so, right? If you look at 2010 and the total sale of medical devices, which again is very, very important, 60% of these were controlled by barely 25 medical device companies across the world. Right? And the list goes on. I mean, I can give you, sort of many other areas, many other sectors where you have this kind of presence and so on. Okay. So in general, this globalization era, neoliberal kind of global capitalism has witnessed a fantastic increase in the power of monopolies all over, right? In terms of production, in terms of finance, and so on and so forth, right? Now, let me come to, and this would be my last couple of points for you. If we look at the period since early 1970s, and if we want to ask ourselves, what are some of the most important markers as processes? I gave you some outcomes as markers, right? But as processes, what is happening that must be understood and flagged as very powerful processes? Now, in particular, 3 or 4 tendencies, during this period is what I would like to emphasize as the beginning of a comprehensive understanding of this story. Number 1, finance capital, which I mentioned earlier, okay, is currently the single most important economic actor in the global economy, right? And it has a very specific attribute, this finance capital. You see, finance capital as a phrase, as a term was coined by Hilferding and Lenin, turning from 19th to the 20th century, if you look at 1898 and around that time, 1900 or so, right? Finance capital at that point in time was supposed to be based on a merger of capital in production and capital as finance. What is capital as finance? Basically, it makes profits through circulation. So you lend money, you get some interest rate and so on. You invest in the stock market, you get some return, etc. Okay. So the distinction between capital in production is that you have to actually invest in material production, agriculture, industry, services, whatever you're doing, right? So that is capital in production. Okay. Capital as finance is one that is supposed to historically facilitate capital in production. What has happened in the last roughly half a century or so is that there was always a kind of conflict between these two and different kinds of capital, but let me not get into that discussion. Okay, but we have, instead of a synergy, intensification of conflict between capital in production and capital as finance. This is one of the most important features of the contemporary phase of imperialism or late neo-colonialism and so on. So the thrust of finance capital today, its major motive is remarkably different from what Hilferding and Lenin had thought almost 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago or so, right? So this is something which then shapes everything in the global economy at the current juncture. Huge amount of work along these to engage with these and understand these and explain these, yeah, have already been put in public domain by a large number of scholars. Paul Sweezy, Gerald Epstein, Pravat Patnaik, Bob Paulin, Samir Amin, and so on and so forth. Yeah. If you want some references, then I'll send you a couple of my papers from where you can get all these references, where I've discussed some of these developments and so on. Right. So this growing financialization of accumulation, right? So you want to make money not through investment, but through circulation. That has become the major shift. So just to give you an example, at 10 o'clock, your money is in Tokyo Stock Exchange. At 10 past 10, it comes to London. At 20 past 10, it goes to New York. And by the end of the day, it has taken a whole round of the world, many rounds of the world, right? And basically, most of accumulation is being done through this processes of financialization, right? Which has, again, multiple dimensions. So you bet on anything. Even bets are placed on Indian rupee, right? What would be its value vis-a-vis the US dollar with the euro and yen and so on and so forth, right? So if you take into account, total bets and total money which is made in any one particular year, it is in billions, right? So why soil your hands, muddy your feet by getting into material production if you can make money like this? Of course, you can lose hell of a lot as well, right? Both happen, yeah? But then this is something which then tends to sort of go against capital in production. And this, as I said, has become a very, very powerful actor, single most powerful economic actor during the phase of neoliberal capitalism. So if you look at 1960s, British finance could not invest in stock markets in the US and vice versa. Now you can put your bet on anything. Yeah. Now this has created a huge facility for what I call casino economy, right? No, speculation is the buzzword of finance capital, and in that sense, yeah. Okay. The second feature as a marker that we need to note is the following: that the current episode of globalization in the last 500 years of capitalism or so is that there has been a huge dilution of the traditional division of labor. Traditional division of labor was that all the state-of-the-art frontier kind of activities in agriculture, services, manufacturing, all that would actually happen in the global north, and the global south was fundamentally supposed to pick up the rest of it. Yeah. So the so-called primary commodities, yeah, food, etc., they should produce it and let them consume as much and so on. Now, let me just give you one small figure at this point in time. If you look at 1750 or so, as it happens, what we know as global south today, which is Africa, Latin America, and Asia, what we sometimes describe as third world and developing countries and so on, in terms of not only their production in agriculture, that is per capita agricultural production, but in terms of per capita non-agricultural production, were in fact ahead of the global north in 1750, ahead of them, right? India and China accounted for, in 1750, between 52 to 59% of total non-agricultural production of the world. Just these two countries. By 1950, their share had been reduced to 2 to 3%. That was colonialism, imperialism of those 200 years and so on. I will not get into details of all this. However, this period was indeed characterized by what I have described as the traditional division of labor. So state-of-the-art activities will happen in the north, and south will pick up, the residue, then so on and so forth. Yeah. What has happened since 1970s is that capital from north, okay, has started flowing into the south as well, in a whole lot of state-of-the-art activities. The reason why China becomes the factory of the world has a lot to do with this, right? Now, this is described as, in loose, kind of analytically loose way of expressing it, global supply chains, global value, commodity chains, value chains, and so on and so forth. I will not get into an analysis of whether this term is appropriate or not, right? I reject these phrases. My own way of putting it is global value system. But let me not get into a conversation on that. The important point to note is that there are two parts to this feature. What is the feature that we are talking about? That capital from north is getting enmeshed directly in the south in many ways. And what are the two most important channels there? One, through actual investments, through FDIs and so on. Two, without any investment, you make various economic enterprises suppliers of what you want. So you get into contracts, so you do not invest a penny, right? But you have all these suppliers who have become much more deeply enmeshed in the global production and consumption. So through both these channels, okay, this, what is generally described, as I said, supply chains, commodity chains, etc. Now, what has this done from the point of view of, let's say, the workers in the south and north and so on? On the whole, this has put huge stress on overall employment, overall prospects for world of work, overall. So look at this most powerful country in the world. Joseph Stiglitz tells you that in the US, between 1969 and 67 to be precise, and 2011, the real wages of American workers, the median American workers, that was stagnant. If anything, it fell slightly. Now imagine the most powerful country in the world, right? Economically speaking, I'm not getting into the military aspect of it. Workers don't get anything out of it. What is happening? Compare that with the preceding 3 decades, 4 decades or so. That is before 1970 or so. Yeah, you get a completely different picture and so on. Again, I will not get into an analysis of why all this is happening, etc. But this is a feature which is very important to understand. And why has it happened? This again is connected with globalization. Many things. Countries which had reasonable infrastructure, okay, to produce what the global north wanted, right? China, some of it India, the auto sector in India, the textile sector in India is very powerfully present in these global value systems, okay? But why is it that either through direct investment or through incorporating them into the supply networks, these countries get preferred? Because they have the basic technology, mainly because of the developments which had happened during the period of regulated capitalism, right? So suddenly, if you look at one particular sector, which is far more important for India than any other sector around this time, around the time that this neoliberal architecture comes into place, look at ITC. Share of ITC, information technology and so on and so forth, and all the enabled services in India's GDP around 1991 was not even 0.5% of GDP. It was sort of 0.38. In roughly decade and a half, it reaches almost 7-8% of GDP, right? Now, this was a dramatic kind of development in a particular sector, yeah, from which this segment gained massively, right? So like China became the factory of the world, India became the office of the world, right? Of course, in terms of number of workers involved there, it was not even 1%. It was actually 0.2%. Okay. But of course, in terms of GDP, etc. Now, these kinds of developments have created very, very important sort of changes in the overall architecture of production, consumption, etc. But the important point to notice, this the second point that I'm referring to, that the control remains very much in the global north. Now, as I said, if you start asking why is it that this happened, because you had infrastructure, and along with that, you had good quality workforce, which was dirt cheap compared to what it was in the global north, right? So in the US, the manufacturing sector, the average wage, hourly wage, sort of late 70s, around 1980, is approximately $23, $24 per hour. At the same time, the wages in China is 64 cents. So China has the same infrastructure, good quality workforce, right? And what had also happened in the long march of capitalism is that the facilities in transportation, technology, communication, these had increased dramatically, right? So you seek, cheap labor, right? Because now, in terms of its cost implications, in terms of reaching there, etc., and transportation, so on, container technology, all that makes very easy to move from one part of the world to the other part in less than, let's say, 24 hours. Yeah. So that is something which is very important. But it is not only cheap labor or good infrastructure. It has to do with a whole lot of other things. Yeah. So some economists have called it global labor arbitrage. So there is the shift of capital from here to there, or sourcing from south to north because of this global labor arbitrage. I call it sort of not only labor arbitrage, but ecology, regulation, and labor arbitrage. Lawrence Summers, many of you must have heard his name. He used to be president of Harvard University at some point, and he had written, it was supposed to be a secret document for the World Bank, when he had said that all polluting industries should be shifted from the north to the south. Why? Because the opportunity cost of life in south is very low. That is what happened indeed. Europe, Western Europe, shifted all polluting industries out of its shores. Textile disappeared. No production. Textile is one of the most polluting industries incidentally. Right? Where does it all this go? Even when you are not sort of directly investing in the south, you are basically through supply mechanisms sourcing these. So they bear all the cost, including the cost of environment, etc. Final point, as in terms of markers, etc., is the third and the fourth industrial revolution. Okay, so the contemporary imperialism, if we want to understand its dynamics, its mechanics, its several underlying processes and so on, these are the very, very important underlying features. Each one of these is connected with two things. One, the long march of capitalism. See, Marx and Engels in the Marxist political economy always thinks of capitalism in terms of its laws of motion, right? So for instance, combined and uneven development is a major law in that framework, right? Incessant concentration and centralization of capital is a major law. Yeah. So if you leave it to its own devices, if there are no powerful interventions from the government or from outside, it is expected that this is what will happen. So all this indeed happened. So these long-run developments which have taken place in that long march of, as I said, the intertemporal evolution of capitalism, right? And then each one of these, the processes that I have highlighted and emphasized as the important markers, these became even more accentuated during neoliberal capitalism because all controls were off, right? In the process, what has happened? Much of what gets produced in the South, okay, in terms of proportions, in terms of surplus value and so on, the share and etc., all that is still getting transferred to the North, right? So these global production systems and global value systems that we are talking about, it is like a smiley curve, yeah, where the production, so that is at the bottom, okay, in terms of what it gets, and research, design, retail, all these activities which are very high value, high end of the value system, all that is located in the North. So to conclude my, to give you just an illustration to conclude, Apple, for instance, it doesn't manufacture anything, right? I mean, all of you, many of you would be having your Apple phone of various vintages, right? Sort of, its parts are produced not in Silicon Valley, okay? In several countries across the world. Finally, it gets assembled in one place. Much of it was happening in Foxconn earlier. Now there are lots of, as you know, conflicts between the US and China and so on. Yeah. Then it is back to final product goes there, and then it gets retailed and distributed and so on and so forth. So what is almost 80-90% of the value, yeah, embodied in any product is taken by companies in the global North. Right? What the global South gets is at best 10 to 20%. In worst case scenarios, 3%, 2%. In the textiles, what Bangladesh manufacturers and suppliers get is barely 3%. So if a garment, a t-shirt costs, let's say $1, which has been sent from Bangladesh, yeah, barely 3 cents of it is retained there. 97 cents is controlled by the top companies. In other words, if you look at the outcomes associated with contemporary imperialism, yeah, these have become much more exploitative, precisely because contemporary imperialism is capitalism of generalized monopolies, which in terms of levers of control strengthens the North even more, right? Although a lot of production is actually taking place in the global South. But if you look at the distribution of the goodies, of returns, all right, I think I have given you in this short period quite a lot to mull over and think, and hopefully you will ask me some questions, respond to some of the things that I have said. Okay, and as I said, Abhiram, if there is an interest, I can send a couple of my recent papers. Recently I had edited a book. It's called Labor Questions in the Global South. And one of the chapters there, which I have done with Paris, is covering some of the issues that I have flagged just now. So I can share that chapter with you if you send me a mail, and anyone interested can then look at it and get into a conversation. Okay, to you now.
Yes, sir. So due to want of time, we might not be able to accommodate a lot of questions. So we'll have to cut short a bit on the Q&A session, but still we do have some questions coming up for you. Like we have received some questions for you. So sir, the one question that we have got is, most of the discussion on imperialism often gets focused on the actions or things that are being done by certain countries in certain places. But I feel that it can also manifest in different ways in all countries, even sometimes even inside a country between the different societies or anything. So what can this also be considered as an imperialism?
Not really. You see, imperialism, that's why I started with a very simple definition. I said extra-national, extra-territorial, reach of capital, and through that reach, all kinds of things and so on. Now, any country, any part of the world is indeed class-divided society. It's obviously there are inequalities of various kinds. Some class, sort of gains a lot more through the economic process. The fact of exploitation is something which is pervasive everywhere, right? But what is happening within a country, that should not be called imperialism as such. Of course, what is important to understand is that the dominant elite can very much be hands in glove with the international oligarchy. Okay, and then this is what is known as the comprador capitalist class. Okay, now that is a feature across the global south. Lots of countries have this feature, that the dominant classes have basically got into an arrangement with the top-notch multinational corporations outside their own countries and work with them. Yeah, then they become extensions of the imperialist mechanisms within the country. Right? But you have to distinguish analytically between what happens within and what happens outside.
Yes, sir, absolutely. So, sir, we have someone from our audience, Parineet Kaur, who intends to ask you something. I'm just unmuting her.
Good evening, sir. Thank you
Good
so much
evening.
for the lecture. So, sir, of course, I have a lot of questions, but I'll just limit it to two. Firstly, so you spoke about the dichotomy between capital in production and finance capital and how there is an increasing split between the two. But I'd just like to understand what your point of view would be with respect to this synergy. How would it end up being beneficial, and why is that synergy important? And secondly, is more of a general question with respect to the markers of imperialism. And he spoke about how it's intra-territorial. So how do you think institutions like the World Bank, IMF, which also have political and economic control, act in the third phase of imperialism, as you spoke about?
Yes. Okay, let me first respond to your second query. Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank, IMF, etc., they have been very powerful servants to the cause of imperialism. Okay, they have been very powerful facilitators, right? And not only these two, but many others, right? ADB and, apart from World Bank, IMF, you have a whole lot of other institutions, okay? And how their role and function became very different compared to what it was, let's say, in 1940s, 1950s, okay? It became very transparent and almost visible to the naked eye that they are out to get the South in general and so on, starting with the sort of debt situation in Mexico 1982 and how that deal was negotiated and so on, which was debt equity kind of arrangement, etc. Yeah. So early 1980s and late 1970s is a turning point in terms of also reconfiguration of what these institutions started doing which were very different from their own constitution in the immediate post-war two era, right? So that's one important thing which we have to keep in mind. Yeah, how this sort of and the first was, sorry, I lost track of the first issue. What did you ask?
So just understanding, why is the synergy between capital and production?
Synergy. Yes. Now, you see, both Hilferding and Lenin, in fact, talk of the increased synergy between two different constituents of capital through the merger during the late 19th, early 20th century, right? So, capital in production always needs finance, right? Support, and not all of it is through their own savings, through their own sources, etc. Right? So right from the beginning, or even before capitalism, capital in finance has been a feature of global economic systems and so on. And there was generally a kind of relationship, partly of conflict, that who wants how much. So for instance, your money lender, right? Think of a traditional money lender who squeezes the poor peasants and the poor farmers and so on. If you go to some of the villages, even today, the rate of interest, the annual rate of interest will work out to some 200%. Yeah, in my fieldwork, I have found sometimes the rates touching almost as high as 360%. Right? Now, that is a very good example of a massive conflict between capital as finance. We are talking of very primitive kinds of capital as finance and capital in production and so on. So a small farmer versus a money lender, right? But in terms of the national architecture of these economic arrangements, Lenin and Hilferding found that indeed there was a coming together of them, because the importance of the nation states and the national economic power at that point in time had assumed huge significance. You see, which is what then leads to, basically within Europe, yeah, and some satellites of Europe. Okay, so the conflict there were such that essentially coming together and strengthening yourself, and that is what lay at the root of this synergy. But once capital crosses a certain size and limit and so on, it possibly wants ever greater freedom, even more freedom and so on. And that was the beginning of their kind of, to some extent, parting their ways vis-a-vis each other, right? So we have to get into a much more detailed, nuanced analysis of why this parting happens from 1960s, 70s, and so on. Yeah, why finance capital as finance, okay, becomes the dominant partner and wants to rule and so on and so forth. But I think we don't have the time to get into a fuller discussion of that. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Also, sir, could you please share some resources?
Of course.
If that be possible. Thank you.
So one of you, I mean, as I said, send me a mail and I'll send some references and some papers, also 1 or 2 papers, which you can, either our own work or some other work which can help you. Yeah. I mean, I'll not do it today or tomorrow, but certainly in a few days, I'll certainly share. Yeah, if you are keen to.
It would be like, we'll anyway be downloading the attendees list and collecting the email ID. So if you could share it to us, we'll be more than happy to pass it on to all our audience.
Yes. I'll be happy to do that.
It was indeed a very insightful session, because this is a field or this topic as such is something very much different from what we learn in our textbooks. So because
what you learn is so limited and so inadequate and so wrong.
Absolutely. So, but unfortunately, due to want of time, we need to cut short with our Q&A and the session as a whole itself. So even our audience, even we have some more Q&As coming in, but so would it be convenient to you if we could collect these questions over mail, and would you be convenient answering them over mail or something?
What you can do is to organize, sort of half an hour conversation at everyone's convenience. because you see, writing mail, it takes time. You know, I will talk. That's perfectly fine. But you know, on an average, I get, you know, so many mails on a daily basis. It becomes crazy.
We do have monthly invited lecture series named Discourse, which happens at Economic Society. So,
so we can sort of organize a discussion as a follow-up of this. You keep all your questions, and then, yeah, we can get into a conversation.
All right. Thank you very much indeed, sir. It was indeed a wonderful session.
Okay.
I believe that the observations you hold are significant for the modern day economy as a whole itself. So may I speak on behalf of the audience itself when I say that we have actually learned tremendously from your invaluable knowledge. So on behalf of the staff and students of SRCC and the Economic Society itself, I thank you wholeheartedly for sharing your time with us. Thank you so much, sir.
My pleasure. Stay well and keep thinking about these issues. These are very important. These are questions of life and death. Okay, for our economic systems. Okay. All right. By then, I will leave. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you.